Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to video number 4 of the Garden Archway Art Quilt series. Today we're going to be filling in the inside, the middle portion of the smaller quilt together. I hope you have been enjoying this art quilt series. I would love to see your pictures. If you want to share your pictures of your Garden Archway quilt, we would all love to see it over on the Creative Crew group. A link will be down in the description box. You can jump over there and share progress of your quilt. So today's video, we are going to be finishing up adding the pieces to the smaller quilt. I'm also going to bring you along and show you the progression of the full-size quilt that I have done on the long arm, just to share some techniques and the progress of that quilt with you. I think you might find it pretty interesting. Make sure you stay tuned to next week. Next Sunday will be the last video of this art quilt series, where we will be creating our layers, covering it with tulle, and doing some quilting to finish up the smaller quilt. I cannot wait. I have loved every part of the process of making this quilt with you. I think it is so pretty and it's been so much fun. All right, I'm getting ready to clear the table. I'm going to show you the progression of adding all of the pieces on the inside, what we still have left to do on this quilt, and let's go ahead and get started. For the middle section of the smaller quilt, I've decided to do the rest of the pieces with freezer paper because that goes really quickly. To save time, I'm going to cut out a whole bunch of pieces all at one time. I'm doing the inside portion of the wall, the little archway, the shadow of the wall. I'm going to go through and number each one of these pieces because I'm going to do all of my tracing all at one time. With each one of my pieces numbered, I can keep track of which piece is which. And then I'll go through and group all of the color sections together. So you'll see I'm tracing all of these pieces. They're all the same number. I'm going to go around the archway. And each one that is color number 14, I'm going to trace in one section of the freezer paper. Once I've traced all of the pieces that are numbered 14, I'm also putting the number that I've assigned to that piece inside that piece as well. I'll do this for each one of the different colors in this archway. So I just draw a line. All of my 14 pieces are grouped together. And I'll do this for each one of the colors. This allows me to do all my tracing all at one time. And then I can do all of my fusing my pieces to fabric all at one time as well. So here are all of my pieces that are numbered 14. I've grabbed the fabric that I want to use for my color number 14, and now I can fuse the freezer paper right to my fabric on the pretty side. And now I'll just spend a lot of time going through and cutting each one of the pieces out directly on the line. To me, this just saves a ton of time. I can prepare a whole bunch of pieces and get them ready. Once I've cut out all of the pieces for the shadow part of the archway, I'm going to go ahead and spend some time arranging my pieces exactly where they go. And you'll see I still have the freezer paper on there. You'll see the numbers that I've assigned all of these pieces. And I have the map with my numbers right next to me so I can reference where each one of the pieces go. Working my way all the way around. Putting all of these little pieces in. I just thought I'd bring you along for this part of the process because I know many of you are making this quilt and I thought it would be helpful for you to see how I attempted to put this quilt together. So now I'm going to be using my Elmer's glue wall, and it's time to go ahead and glue down each one of these pieces. I'm applying a little bit of glue to the back side of the fabric and just using my finger to smooth out and thin the glue so it's nice and thin. That just prevents the glue from soaking to the front of the fabric. It does make a mess on your fingers though. Going through, gluing each one of the pieces. You'll see I jump around a little bit. I have to do some finagling to get some of the pieces to fit exactly right. It might be my tracing, it might be my cutting. It could also be that the spacing of my other pieces was a little off. So I just want to make sure that each one of these pieces fit in their proper place as I work my way around. So I do jump around from side to side and putting these pieces down. Still working our way around. I think one of the funnest parts of doing this quilt is coming up when I take the freezer paper off. So you'll see these little sections right here, I'm having to go in and trim to get them to fit. And that's absolutely fine. I kind of expected to have to do that. Now comes the fun part. The glue is dry and I can just take a pin and poke off that freezer paper and reveal my pieces underneath. Like I mentioned, this is probably one of the funnest parts of making this quilt for me. I just get so much satisfaction seeing the color come to life on the quilt. So that's nice and dry. We can move on to the center, and you'll see here I've already gone through and traced all of my pieces and glued them down. So now we can skip to the fun part of revealing the colors underneath of this freezer paper. Now I did the same exact thing. I went through and numbered each one of these pieces right on my pattern and then traced them out and cut out all of my pieces. And this is it. This is all of the pieces for the Garden Archway quilt put down into place. I absolutely love it. And guess what? You could be done at this point with your quilt top. The things I'm going to show you coming up next are totally optional, so I want you to keep that in mind. I think the quilt is lovely just like this. It is just so pretty. However, one of the fun things about doing an art quilt are all of the things that you can do in addition to your pieces. So I'm just going to bring you along. I'm going to add some shading to some of my pieces and some color using some Derwent Inktense pencils. So all of my pieces are nice and dry on the foundation fabric. Using some water in a squirt bottle, I'm just going to wet the fabric just a little bit. The Inktense pencils are activated by the water. And if you wet your fabric first, it really pulls the color from the pencils, nice and vibrant. I'm just going to go through and add a little bit of color here and there in the sky area, in some of the trees. You could use watercolor pencils, watercolor paints, fabric paints. I've even used nail polish, sparkly nail polish on fabric before. It's an art quilt, so I think we're allowed to break a lot of the quilting rules when it comes to just adding some depth and dimension and some interest to our quilts. Again, this part is totally optional. You could follow the same exact steps that I'm doing, or do something totally different, or leave it completely the way it is. Just adding a little bit of shadows here and there. You'd be surprised what just adding a little bit of some shadows would do to add a lot of depth into your quilt. You can already start to see a little bit of the transformation of just adding some different colors to these fabric pieces. Once I'm done in this middle section, I'll go through and add some color to the stones, the stone wall and the archway around the outside of my quilt. And I'll just bring you along and we'll watch as I add some color. Now that I've added some shadows and some color all the way around, I thought it would also be fun to add some different textures to this quilt, much like we did with the bottom piece, piece number 8 in the very beginning of this series. Except all the pieces are now on my quilt. We can still go in and add little bits of yarn. So I'm just going to use some glue and glue down some bits of yarn here and there. All of this will be covered with tulle on my quilt, so I'm not really concerned about totally gluing these yarn pieces completely down. I just want to tack them down with a little tiny bit of glue so that they'll stay in place when I cover this quilt with some tulle. So adding just a little bits of yarn here and there. It really just elevates this quilt to a different level, adding some textures. It almost adds a little bit of a highlight here and there. Again, this is totally optional. I hope you don't feel like you have to do this. But I just want to give you some ideas of things you might want to try. Once the glue is dry with all of these yarn pieces, I will go through and trim any of the sections of yarn that extend beyond the pieces that they're glued to. So I'll give them a little haircut once the glue is dry. Sometimes I want to do something a little bit different with the yarn. Sometimes I like to go in and add a little bit of glue and then take the yarn and just cut little slivers off of the yarn. What it does is just creates this little colored fuzzy bits that I can smudge into the glue so that it sticks where I want it to. But it just really adds like shadows and definition into certain areas. It gives it a really unique look versus just a solid strain of yarn. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just cutting little slivers of the yarn. It creates a little fuzz that I can work with and move exactly where I want it to go. When this dries, when the glue is completely dry, I will take a dry paintbrush and just brush away any of the fuzz that is loose and just remove that from my quilt top. You'll see in the sky, it just adds a little softer blue area to my sky. And this is it. This is exactly what I've done with my Garden Archway quilt to this point, and I love it. I am so in love with this quilt, and this is where we're stopping right here with the small version until next week when we layer our quilt with tulle and we add some batting and backing and we actually do our quilting. Now, before we go for today, I want to bring you over to the large version of this quilt, which I'm doing on the long arm. Even if you don't have a long arm, I still want you to follow along because you might see some techniques that I use on that quilt that you can absolutely use on the smaller version as well. As I talked about in previous videos in this series, for the larger version of this quilt, I'm using the muslin to create my pieces. So here you'll see I've traced my pieces using the muslin. I've also numbered them so that I can keep track of where I am in the quilt. I'll give my fabric and my muslin a press. So the muslin, I'm adding the glue right straight to the piece that I've traced. And this gets glued to the back side of my fabric for these pieces. I'm drying that glue with a good hot iron, and then I can cut out my pieces. I'm smearing out that glue with my finger just to help prevent the glue from seeping to the front of the fabric. And then as I get some pieces done, I'll move over to the long arm and put them down where they go. You can see I'm still piecing in all of the fabric between my pieces on this quilt. I'm not using one solid color of foundation fabric. And I just have my fabric map here so that I can see where each one of these pieces go. I can line them up, and then I just use a small little bit of Fabri-Tac glue right in the center of my pieces just to tack them down. Once that glue is dry, I can go around, flip up my pieces, and add the color that I want you to see in between all of these pieces, sort of acting like a mortar fabric. This is a great technique if you started off with a foundation fabric, a piece that was big enough to use, but you weren't crazy about the color. This is an easy way to change out the color of your foundation. So just working my way around each one of the pieces. When I'm satisfied with those, we will move to the other side of the quilt. I've already glued down those pieces, and now we can start playing with some yarn bits. I just have this huge fascination with using yarn in my art quilts. Because I'm adding tulle over top of all these pieces, I'm just adding a little bit of glue to tack that yarn down into place. I'm not gluing it solid, just adding, it's like pinning it in place except using glue. And that way when I pull the tulle over top of all of these pieces and the yarn bits that I'm adding, there's not going to be a huge amount of shifting around while I'm tugging with the tulle, bringing it over top of everything. I might have to do a little bit of adjusting, but that's really it. For this one, I'm cutting apart some yarn. I'm going to do some fuzzy bits in between these pieces. This is a really great technique if you made a boo-boo and you don't want to take it off of your quilt, but you want to kind of cover it up. You could add some yarn bits right over top of it. If maybe your spacing was a little bit too far apart, if you don't want to create a new piece, you could just fill in some empty space with some yarn bits. You can see on this one, I'm going to add some sequins right over top of the pieces, and the tulle will cover those pieces and keep all of that sequins down. For this larger version of the quilt, I decided to go with a grass. The smaller version, I did like a stone walkway going through the archway. For the larger one, I thought I would change it up and do more of a grass. And so I've used a green section of fabric for piece number 8. However, to me, it was needing a little something extra. So I'm going through and cutting apart some eyelash yarn, some green eyelash yarn, just cutting snippets of that yarn all over the place. It's just going to lay loose right on top of this fabric. Just like this, I'm just going to fill it in. I'll come in with some different colored yarns just to add some interest, like maybe little speckles of flowers growing in the grass. Maybe some wildflowers growing in the grass. Again, all of this is just laying right on top of the quilt. I have not glued any of this down. The tulle will come right over top of this, and I will quilt to make sure that all of this stays into place. So I have totally transformed this plain piece of green fabric into something that has a lot more interest to look at. So here you can see the other side of the quilt, and I'm still cutting little pieces of yarn all over the place. Again, this is totally optional. You don't have to do any of this, but I thought it would be fun to watch. Now I'm actually cutting up some silky ribbon. Maybe there's little red flowers popping through the grass here and there. So now that I've added all of the little bits and the elements that I wanted to add, now I can go ahead and bring the tulle right over top. I'm going to pin it down in place, and then I can quilt the remainder of this quilt. Everything on the roll up above has already been quilted, and I'm quilting this quilt as I add my pieces, essentially quilting as I go, but right here on the long arm. I also thought it would be fun to bring you along for the quilting part. So the large version of this quilt, what I'm working on now, I am quilting around each one of the stones. I'm even doing some quilting right on top of some of my stones as well. So I'm stitching around each one of the stones like a stitch in the ditch. And then in the stones and in the grass, I'll do some quilting, maybe some pebbles, maybe some small meandering. The smaller version of this quilt, what we're going to actually be working on next week, I'm going to cover it with tulle, and I'm going to do some cross hatching, straight line quilting. So I want you to see what it looks like if you do custom quilting, really going in, stitching around each one of your pieces. I want to give you an idea of what that would look like. But I also want you to see what some straight line quilting will do for your quilt. And you might actually be more comfortable doing the straight line quilting. So that's what we're doing on the smaller version next week. I'm going to cross hatch quilt that quilt with the tulle right over top. It's going to be so gorgeous. I can't wait for that one. That way you'll get an idea of both quilts, completely the same pattern, different background foundation fabrics used, and different quilting used. One's large and one is small. I think there's really no end to the customization that you could do with these quilts. It's one of the things that I love about art quilts. It's just, to me, it's just so fascinating and just so much fun. I'm going to go ahead and finish quilting this quilt and just bring you along so that you get to watch. And then we'll meet when I'm all done. Now that the quilting is done on this quilt, I can take it off and hang it up on the design wall. So this is it for this quilt. This quilt is finished. I'll probably come in and add some elements on top, but this is where we are with the full-size version. I can't wait to see you next week when we finish up this series, the Garden Archway quilt. See you then.